Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs. But luckily, there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.
This episode of Ben Franklin's World is brought to you by Cornell University Press. Cornell University Press likes to say that Ben Franklin would have read Cornell Press books, because Franklin had an inquiring mind and believed that history makes great reading. If you have an inquiring mind and enjoy great history books too, you should check out Cornell's offerings. To take one example, Cornell just published The Dutch Moment by future Ben Franklin's World guest, Wim Klooster. Wim chronicles the spectacular rise and fall of the Dutch Atlantic Empire during the middle decades of the 17th century. The Dutch left a huge mark on the wider Atlantic world, and The Dutch Moment reveals how this empire, which stretched from Europe to the Hudson River, and from the Hudson River south to El Salvador and Brazil, and west to the African Gold Coast, was built and lost in the span of decades. Check out the show notes page for a link to The Dutch Moment and other great titles from Cornell University Press, or visit benfranklinsworld.com/Cornell.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 108 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Today, we're in for a real treat. We're going to explore the life of Esther Wheelwright, a colonial American woman who lived in not one, not two, but in 3 different early American worlds: frontier New England, Northeastern Wabanaki, and Catholic New France. Esther Wheelwright lived a remarkable life, and one that our guest historian, Ann Little, an associate professor of history at Colorado State University, believes opens a window onto the lives of all colonial American women who lived during the 18th century. Ann is going to lead us through the life of Esther Wheelwright, and as she does, she reveals what life was like in Maine during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, details about Wabanaki life and the Native American custom of captive taking, and the story of Esther Wheelwright and her journey from Puritan New English girl to Mother Superior of the Ursuline Order in Quebec, New France. But first, don't forget to subscribe to the Franklin Gazette. It's the weekly newsletter that places the show notes for each episode and all its important links right in your inbox. Subscribing is easy. All you need to do is text BFWorld to 33444 or click the orange Join Now button on the homepage of benfranklinsworld.com. Are you ready to explore what life was like in northern New England, Wabanaki villages, and the city of Quebec during the 18th century? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us is an associate professor of history at Colorado State University. She has a particular interest in the history of women, gender, and sexuality in the early American period. She's a longtime blogger of history and politics at historian.com, and she's the author of 2 books, Abraham in Arms, War and Gender in Colonial New England, and, most recently, The Many Captivities of Esther Wheelwright. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Ann Little.
Thanks, Liz.
When we think about colonial American history, I'm not sure how many of us would think of or even know who Esther Wheelwright was. Yet Esther lived a pretty exciting life, and one that Anne believes can lead us to see all women in colonial America whose leadership, work, and prayer were centrally important to their nation. And before we dive into the life of Esther Wheelwright, would you give us a brief overview of who she was, why you think she's worth knowing about, and why you think her life opens a window onto the lives of all women in colonial America?
Well, this was my central interest in writing about Esther Wheelwright from the beginning, because the fact is that she lived as an intimate, as a native, in all three of the major cultures in North America in the 18th century. She lived in colonial New England, in an Anglo-American town. She lived among the Wabanaki, and then she lived most of her life in New France, in Quebec, in the Ursuline convent. So this is really unusual for girls and women especially. Now, most men also do not cross borders and do not live as intimates of other cultures other than their birth cultures. But the examples that other historians have written about as go-betweens or middlemen or cultural brokers, they're all men. So Wheelwright's life struck me as especially fascinating because it's so unusual for girls and women to cross these borders and to live as intimates of these cultures. Only Esther Wheelwright lived in all three as an insider.
Esther Wheelwright sounds like an interesting woman. How did you come across her story?
In the course of writing my first book, I used Anglo-American captivity narratives, men's and women's captivity narratives, as a way of trying to understand the experiences of both Native families that adopted or at least temporarily hosted Anglo-American captives within their families, and as a way of learning about that experience from the perspective of the Anglo-American men and women who wrote these narratives. Esther Wheelwright, of course, never wrote a captivity narrative. I have no insight into how she understood her life story, unfortunately, because these are only written by Anglo-American people who are returned to Anglo-American culture. And the whole part of the ritual of writing the captivity narrative was sort of reaffirming one's affiliation with Protestantism and with Anglo-American culture and values. Nevertheless, there are some important antiquarians and amateur historians who wrote about Esther's life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I really couldn't have written this book without their assistance, nor could I have written my first book without their assistance. Their names are Alice Baker and Emma Lewis Coleman. And they wrote a couple of fascinating books that focused on the lives of New England captives carried to Canada. And Emma Lewis Coleman, sort of encyclopedia of all of the New England captives carried to Canada. She wrote a mini biography of Esther Wheelwright, and Baker wrote a biographical essay that she had published in the late 19th century, I believe. And I wondered, here I am, a young feminist historian, at least at the time I was young. Here I am, almost 30 years old, and I've never heard of this woman. How could I have studied women's history and early American history and never come across her story? And it really struck me as a kind of a disappointing and fascinating contrast to the focus on early American men's biographies, right? I mean, we get new biographies of the so-called founding fathers every year. There have to have been at least 2,000 biographies published in the 20th century alone about some of the biggest names, right? Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. Is there really no room whatsoever in early American historiography for a fascinating woman's story? And so my writing of this book was an effort to test that theory.
Well, let's dive into your book and into Esther Wheelwright's life. Now, Esther's life starts in Maine, and Maine seems like a good place for us to start too. Would you tell us about Maine in the late 17th and early 18th centuries? What was life like in Wells?
Wells, Maine, which is part of York County, Maine now, was at the time in the 18th century up until 1820 part of the province of Massachusetts. It was recognized as a separate kind of outlier in Massachusetts, however. Nobody went to Maine because they were wealthy or important or especially devout in terms of Puritan devotion. The people who ended up in Maine were either outcasts from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, much like Esther Wheelwright's great-grandfather, John Wheelwright, who was expelled from Massachusetts along with Anne Hutchinson as part of the antinomian controversy. But for the most part, Mainers are people who came to Maine to fish. For any of you who know Maine now, that probably will not surprise you. They did not come to Maine to pray or to pursue a particular strain of dissenter belief. People in Maine were basically profit-seeking Virginia-type colonists. They just happened to end up in a fairly northerly climate that doesn't really support plantation agriculture. So early Maine is full of explorers, fishermen, and these outcasts. And the Anglo-American families who invaded Maine and settled there made their living much like Esther Wheelwright's family did through a variety of different pursuits. So, you're familiar with the notion of the gig economy now. That was, and some would say still is, sort of central to how Mainers pursue their livings, right? They don't just fish. They probably have a little farm. They also engage in some trading, especially, working as brokers in between Boston and the Wabanaki, who might have trade goods that they want to sell to a wider Anglo-American market. And, for example, John Wheelwright and his wife, Mary Snell Wheelwright, they had a tavern license. So in the Wheelwright garrison, in addition to Esther Wheelwright and her sisters and brothers and the servants and slaves in the household, there were also frequently travelers that they boarded, sometimes for just a night or two, sometimes for longer. They also served meals and sold beer and spirits to passersby. So the Wheelwrights were a typical Anglo-American frontier family in that respect, I think. Entrepreneurial, hands in a lot of different pots, trying to make a living any way they could. But they weren't especially wealthy or elite, that's for sure.
One of the curious things that I read in the many captivities of Esther Wheelwright was that the Wheelwrights lived in a house within a garrison, which Anne described as pretty typical for families living in early Maine settlements. Anne, would you tell us about Maine garrison life?
That's a great detail to pick up on, Liz. I think that really tells us a lot about what life was like for these early English and Anglo-American invaders and colonists. They entered a colony that was at the time populated overwhelmingly by Wabanaki people. That is the Native Americans who are now called Wabanaki. They're made up of 5 different tribes: the Abenaki, the Micmac, the Maliseet, the Penobscot, and the Passamaquoddy. And in the early 17th century, there were a few French, mostly Jesuit, and maybe some Recollect missionaries who had set up small missions there, but there were no French colonial settlers or invaders other than the missionaries. As anybody who knows any of the history of the Laurentian Valley or early French Canada knows, the Algonquian people very early on seized upon the presence of the French and made them their allies. So from the beginning, Wabanaki people were suspicious of the English invaders, especially when they brought families with them and established growing families. And they were understood to be a threat to the economic and political dominance of the Wabanaki people from the very beginning. So that's why families like the Wheelwrights lived inside garrisons. There were very few provincial soldiers who were ever stationed in these garrisons. These really were sort of private enterprises, private fences and borders that were put up by individual families like the Wheelwrights, or sometimes a town would collaborate on building a big fence and turning the whole town into a kind of a garrison.
So it's possible that colonists could live in Maine and not live in a garrison. But it sounds like if you were living there, you wanted to be neighbors or friends with someone who did own a garrison.
Well, if you were an Anglo-American person, yeah, sure. When I started writing this book, I thought about them initially as basically West Bank settlers, Israeli West Bank settlers in Palestine, right? And that's kind of what early Maine was. It was a territory that Wabanaki people were struggling to continue to make their living from. It was a territory that was beginning to be invaded and influenced by Jesuit and Recollect missionaries. And then you have these small but fairly rapidly growing Anglo-American towns, these people who look like they had invaded and come to stay. So Wabanaki people were understandably very alarmed by their presence, especially because they seemed to have no interest in learning Wabanaki language and learning about Wabanaki ways of life. These are people who, were foreigners who were determined to impose their way of life on Wabanaki territory.
It sounds like the Anglo-Wabanaki relationship was fraught with tension. In that vein, would you tell us about the Wabanaki raid that occurred on August 10, 1703? That raid where the Wabanaki took Esther Wheelwright captive?
This is not the first time that Wells had been targeted by the Wabanaki. There had been a series of attacks. The way I write about it in my books is basically that from the beginning of King Philip's War in 1675 until the official end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, we have nearly a century of almost uninterrupted warfare between Native people, English and Anglo-American people, and French-Canadian people in the northeastern borderlands. So Wells and its near neighborhood of York County had been repeatedly attacked by Wabanaki raiders in the 1690s during King William's War. And so at the outbreak of Queen Anne's War, which had just begun officially the year before Esther Wheelwright was taken, that region was targeted again. So on August 10th, 1703, we don't really know exactly how it all went down or what happened because unfortunately all we have are these sort of panic dispatches from a few of the Anglo-American settlers saying, oh, the Indians came and raided and here's the list of the people who were killed or who were taken in the raid. But nobody sits down to write a narrative account of what happened. And as I said earlier, unfortunately, Esther Wheelwright never did, even from her very young perspective. She was 7 years old, about 7.5 years old at the time that she was taken. Interestingly, she's the only person from her birth family who was taken captive. However, she appears to have been taken captive along with a couple of her cousins, Abigail Parsons, who is age 6, and Hannah Parsons, who is age 2. Those are not the only children in the Parsons family who were affected by the raid. Sadly, the Wabanaki raiders executed the 2 boys who were ages 4 and then a very young boy, a toddler of about 1. They were executed when the Wabanaki first arrived in the village, presumably. What's interesting to me is that Hannah, who's only age 2, survived this raid. And one of the theories that I've adopted from my colleague Julie Wheelwright, who also published a biography of Esther Wheelwright 5 years ago, and as you can tell from her surname, she is a Wheelwright family member and indirect descendant of Esther Wheelwright. Her theory is that Esther was perhaps assisting her aunts with her somewhat younger cousins, Abigail, Hannah, and the 2 little boys. And, as a 7-year-old, she had been sent over to entertain the other little kids, and that the Wabanaki arrived and they scooped her up along with the rest of the Parsons family who survived the attack. And I like to think that maybe she is responsible for the survival of Hannah. Hannah was young enough that she, too, might have been summarily executed because Native American raiders, when they took people captive, unless a baby was still a babe in arms, a tiny infant, or say about age 4, age 5, able to walk long distances and able to be quiet and shut up when you're told to shut up, those children survived the raids. But people who are, say, toddler aged up to about age 4 tend to do pretty poorly because they tend to be emotionally unregulated and unregulatable and also too big to carry. But I like to think that maybe Esther, as the bigger girl, might have played a role along with Hannah's sister Abigail in ensuring her survival. So we don't know exactly what happened, but given the fact that this Parsons family was taken captive in this raid, but nobody else in the Wheelwright family was, we might presume that Esther had been sent over to help out her aunt, and that's why she was taken, but none of her brothers and sisters were.
I'd like for us to look at Esther's life in her new Wabanaki home. But before we do, you mentioned something curious, that Native Americans typically took captives. This is not a practice that Anglo-Americans like the Wheelwrights would have done if they had been fighting the Wabanaki. Would you tell us about the Native American practice of captive taking?
Yes. One of the things that many historians have written about, and I wrote about this a little bit in my first book too, one of the interesting nodes of cultural conflict is over the use and conduct of warfare between Native Americans and Europeans. When Anglo-American people invaded North America and began going to war on Native people sometimes, but also very frequently, especially in the first century or so, allied with some Native peoples against other Native peoples. Whether or not they were allied with the English, Indian people tended to see European styles of warfare as unbelievably barbaric and brutal because Europeans like to fight to the death. Native people saw warfare as an opportunity not to sort of leave bodies on the battlefield, but to capture bodies and use them to augment your strength in numbers as a community. So this is why, especially after 40 or 50 years of pretty aggressive English invasion in early Acadia and the spread of disease and the colonial warfare that preceded the turn of the 18th century, Native populations had been severely diminished by that point. So they were eager not so much to sacrifice their lives in the service of their nation, but rather to capture and add people to their community. Esther was really lucky in being age 7 when she was taken, in part because she was old enough to walk and to be quiet and therefore to survive. But I also think she was fortunate in being only 7 because at that point, I believe her brain would have still been highly plastic, and she would have been able very quickly to learn the etiquette and the rules of living in a Wabanaki family. Her brain would have been very open to learning another language fairly quickly. So I think in many respects, she was taken at the ideal age for optimum survival in those circumstances.
Well, we may not be 7 years old, so it may take us a bit longer to adjust, but we'd love to get a better idea of Esther's life and the customs in her new Wabanaki home. Would you tell us where the Wabanaki took Esther and what her life was like when she arrived?
Well, here's another challenge of writing this book. I have no documentation of this. We have no documentation whatsoever specifically of her experiences in the 5 years that she lived among the Wabanaki. She was taken, we do know, by people who are identified as the Kennebec Indians, the Kennebec Abenaki, the Kinabeki, or sometimes they were just called the Canada Indians, which I think tells you a little bit about their political and religious affiliations and alliances. They're also known as the Norridgewock. Norridgewock is still the name of a town in Maine on the Kennebec River. So perhaps she was taken to the village at Kennebec. She would not have lived there very long, however, because less than 2 years after Esther was taken, that village was burned to the ground by an Anglo-American military expedition. That was a village that the English had been targeting for several years up to that point, in part because that was the home of one of the more prominent and proximate to the English settlements anyway, French Jesuit missions to the Indians. So she might have been taken to Norridgewock. We're not really sure. The warfare in the northeastern borderlands turned Wabanaki people into refugees within their own country. If you think about the situation that's going on in Syria right now, I think that's perhaps very similar to the experiences of Wabanaki people throughout King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and through many of the wars of the 18th century. So unfortunately, I think her life among the Wabanaki would not have been a very settled life. I don't know if she would have had the opportunity to assist in farming crops along with her Wabanaki sisters or aunties. We don't really know. What we do know is that life was very unsettled and that people tended to be on the move. And this, of course, because people weren't able to get crops in the ground necessarily at the time they needed to go in the ground, or they might have had to flee in the summer because unfortunately the season of warfare and the season of crop growing and tending tend to overlap almost perfectly in the 18th century. It would have been a hard living for her. That said, she would not have been treated any differently than the other Wabanaki children in the community. Because of her age and because of her sex, I'm pretty confident that she would have been adopted by a Wabanaki family, perhaps to replace a dead sister or child, somebody who might have perished because of warfare or disease or starvation. So whatever the Wabanaki had, they would have shared with her. She would not have been expected to work or to perform in a servile capacity in that family any more so than anybody else would have been expected to.
We know at some point between 1708 and 1709, Esther came to reside in Quebec. Would you tell us about the city of Quebec in the early 18th century and how you think Esther came to that city?
Again, we don't have any documentation of her life among the Wabanaki, and so we don't know exactly why that fell apart or why she was brought to Quebec. We do know a couple of things. First of all, the trauma and the dislocation of chronic warfare, starvation, and disease probably made her Wabanaki family and community very fragile. So it's quite likely, I'm afraid, to say that her leaving the Wabanaki community might have been the result of yet another kind of trauma, similar to the trauma of her being taken from her birth family and community in Wells. We do know that one of the missionaries associated with the Norridgewock mission, a guy by the name of Jacques Bigot, was recalled to Quebec to take an administrative role, and his brother Vincent Bigot, was left among the Norridgewock. So Jacques and Vincent Bigot were literally brothers in addition to both of them being Jesuit priests. They were birth brothers. They had been funneling young Wabanaki girls to the Ursuline convent for more than 20 years by the time that Esther Wheelwright appears as a student being enrolled in the Ursuline convent in January of 1709. So that's the first specific documentation we have of Esther Wheelwright being in Quebec. Some subsequent correspondence by the governor and the governor's wife refers to a young captive English girl being in their household about that time period or a little before then. So I believe that she probably was brought to Quebec in the company of Jacques Bigot, who had brought so many other Wabanaki girls to the Ursuline convent in probably sometime the autumn of 1708. So just about exactly 5 years after she was taken in August of 1703.
We're going to talk a lot about the Ursuline nuns and their convent from this point forward because Esther ends up joining their order. But before we get there, could we talk about the role that Catholicism played in the life of New France and its people? We know that in colonial New England, of course, religion was central to many of the colonists' lives. But what role did religion play in the life of the inhabitants of New France?
Catholicism was not the motive for most people to migrate to Canada, but it was a very powerful motive for the religious men and women, that is to say, the priests and the nuns who came to early Quebec. And because early Canada had a hard time getting people voluntarily to migrate, even men were unwilling to leave France to go to Canada, by comparison, certainly to the migration that happens in the Anglo-American colonies to the south from England. Women almost entirely refused to migrate to Canada, French women. But the people who were most enthusiastic about migrating to Canada were the religious people, the Jesuit and Recollect priests who came to Canada, and the Ursuline and Augustinian nuns who came to Canada in the 17th century as well. So Catholic religious are really a huge portion of the voluntary migrant women and men to the colony, especially proportionally of the women. The services that the women's orders provided were especially key to life in early Quebec, in part because there were so few non-religious women who wanted to migrate to Canada. So this is a colony that is really suffering from an absence of French women's labor. So the services that the women's orders provide, education in the case of the Ursulines, and then nursing and hospice care and running the poorhouse in the case of the Augustinian nuns, they really offer critical social services to a colony that is in desperate need of this kind of work. So Catholicism really shaped a lot of the social life of the colony, in addition, of course, to the religious life of the colony. And as I write in my book, in some respects, it becomes even more important after the British conquest, because, of course, being French in a British colony is also very much defined, at least as much by Catholicism, at least as much by religion as it is by language or ethnicity.
You touched on this a bit when you mentioned that the Ursuline nuns provided education. Would you tell us more about the Ursuline order and the place they held within the community of Quebec?
The Ursulines were teachers. This is in part why they were founded. The Ursulines I think of them as kind of the female version of the Jesuit order. Or rather, I should say the Jesuits are the male version of Ursulines, because the Ursuline order was founded before the Jesuits were founded by Ignatius Loyola. The Ursulines were founded earlier in the 16th century, but they're very much a counter-Reformation or Catholic Reformation order. There's a movement afoot among women's religious communities around the time of the Protestant and Catholic Reformations in the 16th century that women's orders need to do more than just pray the hours and, engage in the kind of late medieval mysticism that many religious orders supported. If you're thinking about the life of St. Teresa, for example, that's kind of a classic late medieval / very early modern Catholic woman's story. So early modern nuns in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries decide that they need to have jobs. They need to have an apostolate. The Ursulines decide that the role they need to play is basically in education, educating the daughters, especially of middling to quite wealthy families, that this is a key way to re-Catholicize Europe in the 16th century. So they become teachers. They become teachers of girls. And this really is a huge innovation, not just in terms of European history, but when it comes to early North America, because there's really no such thing as schools dedicated to girls until the Ursulines arrive in 1639 with Marie de l'Incarnation and the founders of the Ursuline order in Quebec. And there really is no such thing like that in New England until the later 18th century. So this really is an innovation for colonial North American girls at the time the Ursulines arrive. The Ursulines, though, are not just interested in teaching French colonial girls when they arrive. They see a big part of their presence in Canada is contributing to the missionary effort, the outreach to teach Native people to pray as Catholics and to get baptized and become part of the Catholic faith. The Ursulines of Quebec, for about the first century that they were in Quebec, promised to teach Little French and Native girls, specifically. So that was a big part of their outreach and their purpose for being in Quebec, was teaching Native as well as little French girls.
Let's bring Esther back into our conversation. So she arrives in Quebec sometime between 1708 and 1709. She's brought to the city by a French Jesuit brother and is introduced to the Ursuline order, which at some point she decides she'd like to join. Would you tell us that story? I mean, how did Esther Wheelwright decide to take up a Catholic religious life?
Again, we don't exactly know because she never gives us an autobiography or any kind of insight into these questions herself. We have little snips and little clues about what's happening in the Ursuline convent records throughout her life. So let's think about the world from her perspective in the winter of 1709. She arrives in Quebec. She is housed in the home of the governor, Vaudreuil, initially. Now, this makes it sound like she's being received as some kind of fancy diplomat or special guest. She was not. And Vaudreuil, when he writes letters about her, he complains about the huge expense that he's been put to entertaining the daughter of a governor of a small place, as he calls her. But he never calls her by her proper name. At one point, he refers to her as Esther O'Wellen. French people have trouble, I think, pronouncing and thinking of the name Wheelwright with the hua sound as the initial consonant there. She, for perhaps the first time in more than 5 years, has an opportunity to have 2 or 3 hot meals a day. I mean, she would have been fed alongside the other guests of the governors. You know, there are all kinds of traveling diplomats and soldiers and captives and prisoners and all kinds of people in the governor's house at this time. But I think that the isolation, in some respects, of going into the Ursuline monastery, the comfort there, the regular meals, I think this would have come as a huge relief to a growing adolescent, right? I mean, she's 12 years old. She's going to turn 13 in March of 1709. She's moving across international borders once again at a very significant age. If you think back to your own experiences as, say, a middle schooler, an early adolescent, moving into teenage years, these are years in which children today experiment with a lot of, trying on a lot of different identities and a lot of different activities. I think that she would have seen the Ursuline convent school as a welcome, calm, and blessedly regular place for her to live after 5 years essentially on the run from English soldiers. So sometime in the summer of 1710, she goes to the choir nuns, that is to say the teachers, the elite nuns, and she says that she would like to stay as a nun in the quality of a choir nun. In 1710, she is only 14 years old. She's fairly recently turned 14. This is a very young age, a little too young probably to become a nun, even if she had her parents' permission and a dowry. But in the next year, the nuns deliberate on this, and she is admitted to the novitiate then in the fall of 1712. So at the age of 16, she begins to prepare for the rest of her life as an Ursuline choir nun.
It seems like Esther led a fairly successful life as an Ursuline nun. Would you tell us about her life and the work she did with the order?
Oh, she had a phenomenally successful life as a nun. First of all, she lives to the age of 84, which is not untypical or atypical for religious women. As you probably know, the reason that women's life expectancy was relatively low, most women's life expectancy was relatively low in the 18th century, it's because of the risk of death by childbirth. So that obviously is not a problem for cloistered nuns. She climbs through the ranks of the choir nuns and becomes, towards the end of her life, the first and still the only foreign-born Mother Superior of the order in Quebec. And that's a record of almost 400 years standing. Along the way, she's elected to various different offices within the order, but it's clear that she was a very good, or at least very responsible, teacher of girls. She was elected novice mistress several times. She served in all of the offices that one typically serves in if one is being groomed for major leadership responsibilities within the convent. And this is really remarkable when you think about where she started life as a little Puritan girl, as somebody who then became probably, at least, all the evidence that I've been able to assemble sort of from sideways directions, she probably became a very dutiful and responsible young Wabanaki daughter, and then, made her way to Quebec and into the Ursuline convent and probably became a star student, even as a non-native French speaker. So this is really a remarkable story of one woman's will to survive and to succeed in serving in the ways that she believed that God was calling her to serve.
Did Esther have opportunities as a nun that she wouldn't have had in a secular life?
Yes. Well, really going back to her student days in 1709 to 1713, 1714 or so, she was surrounded by the daughters of French colonial officers, governors' daughters, the daughters of the intendants, daughters of wealthy fur merchants in Montreal. Early modern convents were spaces in which status and noble lineage were highly prized. This is another story of her remarkable transformation. The Ursulines, throughout her life, they call her Anglaise, Esther Anglaise or Esther Angloise. She's always being marked by her Anglo-American identity, her birth identity. Nobody wants to talk about her years among the Wabanaki. That is not seen as something that Ursulines want to talk about or remember or praise. But her English identity is what they harp on, both, I think, to help erase her Wabanaki identity that she would have adopted for 5 years, and also, I think, to kind of set her apart from them, from the daughters of these French colonial elites. She's held in some suspicion as she attains these different offices. And I think it's quite significant that she was elected Mother Superior after the British conquest. A year after the British conquest, she's elected Mother Superior. And then she serves for 2 consecutive terms and then 1 more term before she is done with the major leadership roles. But in Wells, Maine, had she stayed in Wells, Maine, there's no way that she would have had the opportunity to become a teacher, to gain the administrative skills and experience that she would have needed to succeed as Mother Superior, and she did succeed as Mother Superior. She became the leader of one of the most elite convents in all of New France. In that respect, I see her as a remarkably successful politician, effectively, because I think we can't but see her election in 1760 as a highly political act by the Ursulines. So, for example, after she's elected Mother Superior in 1760, the year after the British conquest in 1759, with their victory on the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, she becomes the leader of this convent in a time in which the French Catholics in Quebec are uncertain as to whether or not their religion is going to remain legal, because up to this point, there's no such thing as a Catholic British colony. Roman Catholicism was identified, especially by New Englanders, but also by English people as well, in their wars against France through the 18th century as one of the major reasons why the French and the British were at war all the time, that, British were Protestant and the French were Catholic. So this is in part a kind of a prosecution of the older era of religious wars. So she's leading this convent between 1760 and 1772, off and on. And the convent manages to increase its numbers of nuns. It grows dramatically the number of students it has. She supervises the production of all kinds of little objects, artistically wrought objects that become a big hit for the new British tourist trade that pops up in Quebec. So she manages to put the convent on a very secure financial footing, sees that it's growing in numbers of people who are affiliated with the convent as well. And this is all through a time period until the passage of the Quebec Act in 1774, which your listeners who know anything about the history of the American Revolution will remember was really instrumental in radicalizing Protestant New Englanders against Great Britain. This is the most intolerable of all of the intolerable acts, as they're called, in American history. The passage of the Quebec Act, of course, comes as a great relief to French Canadians because, for the most part, they can keep their priests and they can continue to be lawfully Catholic. But for this whole time period, most of the time period that Esther is Mother Superior, the future of Roman Catholicism in the colony is very uncertain. But she manages to lead her order through this very perilous passage and puts it on the firmest financial footing than it had ever been on.
Did Esther forsake her English family when she became a Catholic nun? Did she ever try to reach out to the Wheelwrights, or did the Wheelwrights ever try to reach out to her while she was in the Ursuline convent?
There's evidence in the convent records that her English family is interested in getting her back shortly after she arrives in the convent. And this is one of the motivations that the Ursulines have for agreeing to accept her as a choir nun. The only way that they can keep her is if she takes sacramental vows of some kind, right? If she either marries or if she takes religious vows. Those are both considered irrevocable in terms of repatriation. Nobody can be repatriated involuntarily after having taken sacramental vows. So there are hints that the Wheelwrights are interested in getting her back. Unfortunately, however, there is no direct evidence of this. The Ursulines did not preserve any letters that the Wheelwrights might have tried to get to Esther. There is only one letter in the convent that suggests that there was ever any attempts in later life in which Esther has any contact with the Wheelwrights. And that is a letter that she writes to her mother, thanking her mother for letting her know that her father has died. So this is, I think, in 1747. She's 51 years old. She's been in the convent for nearly 40 years, since 1709. Her mother apparently wrote to her to let her know that her father had died and to ask her to come home again. And Esther, who is at this point a very experienced teacher, she's a middle-aged woman. Again, she's been in the convent for 38 years at that point. She writes to her mother and says, no, why don't you join me here? Why don't you, begin to worship in the faith of our ancestors? She responds in the way that a teacher and a missionary would respond, which is, no, thank you. I'm quite happy here. This is where I think God wants me to remain, and I would be thrilled if you would join me. She very politely but very firmly informs her mother that she will not be leaving the convent. So that's about the extent of the Wheelwright family relationship that I've been able to determine. Now, my friend Julie Wheelwright, she is more persuaded that the Wheelwrights never would have given up on Esther. However, the Wheelwrights had 8 other living children. They had a highly successful family in northern New England and southern Maine, and I'm sure that they missed her. I'm sure that they mourned her loss. But they had a busy life and a big family, and all of those children went on to have families of their own. So all in all, I think the Wheelwrights, certainly when you compare their family to contemporary families in Boston, where children are very vulnerable to death by disease, I think the Wheelwrights are a highly successful family. They have a lot of descendants. That they have one who became a nun and therefore didn't have children and became a Roman Catholic. That really did not damage their prospects for distributing their DNA across southern Maine.
Before we move into the time warp, I think we need to address something. Throughout our conversation, you've said, we lack documentation. We don't have information here. We just don't know. What did you do when you couldn't find documentation? How did you find enough information to tell Esther Wheelwright's story?
Well, it was a big challenge to me as a historian to write about someone whose life was not traditionally documented or even very regularly or faithfully documented. As I've suggested, years go by without traditional documentation about the course of her life. So what I did as a historian is I turned to the people around her, to the immediate world around her. I learned a lot from historians who write about sensory history, right? What is it that people were seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, and tasting? I write a lot about food and the food ecology of the different places that she lived. I write a lot about environmental history. I kind of use environmental history techniques for trying to reconstruct the world around Esther Wheelwright, even if I don't know exactly where she was or what she was doing. I've learned a lot from my colleagues who are beginning to use age as an analytical category. So thinking about, well, what would it have been like specifically to be a 7-year-old girl or a 12-year-old girl or a 14-year-old girl or an 18-year-old young woman or a middle-aged woman or an older woman? What experiences would she be having physically with her own body? So I tried to think about things that way. There are a number of captivity narratives written by captives who returned to New England who had long experience living within Wabanaki families and who may also have lived among French-Canadian families as well. And so I use those when I think they can give me some insight into Esther's experiences. The Jesuit relations, of course, were a huge source for me because fortunately the 2 priests that I believe she would have known and worked with fairly closely, Jacques and Vincent Bigot, they both wrote several letters describing their work among the Wabanaki. Very disappointingly, though, none of those letters reference Esther Wheelwright specifically. So I think that her survival and her movements up until she was 12 or 13 was probably just good luck and her success at blending in with whatever community was going to help ensure her survival. And it's only when she began her formal education in the Ursuline convent and only when she became a choir nun that her capacity for leadership and her other intellectual and managerial skills had an opportunity to be recognized.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, What would have happened if the governor of New France had sent Esther back to her New England family in 1708 or 1709? What do you think her life would have been like? And would it still be a life worth knowing about?
I think she would have had a life like that of her sisters. I think she would have probably married somebody fairly local, if not somebody from Wells, somebody from within the Anglo-American community, possibly a traveler or a trader coming through the Wheelwright garrison. I think she would have had a large family, or as large a family as she could, before menopause or before succumbing to death in childbirth, or fairly shortly after childbirth, as some of her sisters did. To the extent that I think all women's lives are important for us to know about, yes, I think her life would have been interesting to learn about, but I'm not really sure we would have known very much about her other than the record of her marriage and the children that she would have borne. This is all we know about her sisters. So, yeah, as I say in my introduction, I think if she had not been taken captive by the Wabanaki, if she had not been taken over the border into New France by Father Bigot, she probably would have lived a life of quiet obscurity, and she might be commemorated by, letters that are slowly eroding and fading limestone in a cemetery in Maine somewhere. But that's it. She would not have had the opportunities for leadership and for dramatic contributions to her community that she had in Quebec.
So, Anne, now that you've uncovered the story of Esther Wheelwright, what are you researching and writing about now?
I am thinking about the Empire waistline. I'm thinking about fashion and the body in the early U.S. Republic. So I'm leapfrogging over the American Revolution, which I talk a little bit about the American Revolution in my Esther Wheelwright book, and I talk a little bit about Arnold's attempted invasion of Quebec. But other than that, that's it for my involvement in the American Revolution. I'm leapfrogging over that, and I'm thinking about the Empire waistline. Why did it appear when it appeared? Why did it disappear when it disappeared? It seems to me like this dramatic revision in fashion and the ways in which women's bodies in particular were presented. It seems to me that this has something to do with the age of revolutions in both France and in the Americas, of course in the United States and in Haiti, but I'm not sure what. I think in some ways it seems a little too easy to say that the Empire waistline with the very abbreviated stays and sort of, highlighting the bust line, that this is a liberation from former styles of presenting women's bodies and from the old-fashioned stays. In some respects, I think that it was maybe more constraining for some women to have their body displayed that way. So once again, I'm kind of meditating on the meaning of liberty. I'm thinking about what is liberation, what are constraints, and can there be more liberty sometimes in some kind of constraint? Because I think in some respects, absolute freedom can be deranging.
And where should we look for more information about you and how we can contact you if we still have questions about colonial Maine, Quebec, or Esther Wheelwright?
The easiest place to find me is at historian.com. That's just the word historian with an extra N, like my name, ANN.com. And there you can find links to about me, about my books, my faculty webpage, how to reach me via email, all of that kind of stuff. And I'm also on Twitter at historian.
And Little, thank you so much for taking us through the life of Esther Wheelwright and for opening a window onto what life was like in northern New England and in New France.
Thanks, Liz. It was really fun talking to you.
Esther Wheelwright lived a remarkable and perhaps even a lucky life. As Anne noted, being taken captive by the Wabanaki and raised a Catholic afforded Esther opportunities she wouldn't have had if she'd stayed on the Maine frontier. In Maine, Esther would not have received a formal education or had the chance to serve her community as a teacher. She would have been expected to marry, keep house, and have lots of children, a biological process that resulted in the death of many early American women. But as an Ursuline nun, Esther had the option of a different life. She received a formal education, pursued a career as a teacher and administrator, and being a nun gave Esther time to devote herself more fully to her practice of religion. As Anne noted, it's hard to say exactly why Esther made the choices she did. But Anne's research shows that age and the hard life of frontier New England and Wabanaki villages may have had a great deal to do with her decisions. Now, aside from showing us a great deal about the different lives and roles women played in the life of early America, Anne's work on Esther Wheelwright also reveals that when historians research history, they sometimes need to look beyond written sources in order to get at the lives of the people they're studying. Sometimes historians need to look at the artifacts people left behind, consider how environment and age shape someone's experiences, and explore how others who lived with and around the people they're studying lived, so that when historians lack sources, they can attempt to do what Anne did: get at the history sideways. Look for more information about Anne, her book, The Many Captivities of Esther Wheelwright, plus links and notes to everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/108. Cornell University Press not only sponsored this episode, they created a special sales page just for you. The page offers select titles including The Dutch Moment and the book featured in next week's episode, The Enlightenment of Cadwallader Colden, at a discount of 30%. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/Cornell for more information, or click the link on the show notes page or in your free Ben Franklin's World app. What do you think about Esther Wheelwright's story? Do you think it sheds light on aspects of how all women in colonial America live, or do you think her life was just too remarkable? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. In our third season of Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore some of the biggest issues dividing these global powers today: Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, China's growing military might, and also robots. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.